So for the last few weeks of the class, we will talk about life in the ocean. We will start with a general overview of life in the ocean this week. Then we will move on to evolution and natural selection, which is a very important aspect of life in the ocean and life on Earth as well. And then we'll wrap it up in the third week with a description of specific things that live in the ocean. So the photosynthesizers, the producers, and the consumers as well, which include animals and microscopic organisms and plants. All right, so we're going to start with just a general overview of life in the ocean. And the first thing we might want to think about is exactly what is life? How do we know if something is alive? And so in the class, I would throw this out and ask you guys to make some suggestions. And so I'm going to leave this slide blank for a few seconds so you can just think about, how do you know if something is alive? What does it mean when we say something is alive? So here's what the biologists have come up with. Number one, living things require and use energy. They can capture, store, and transmit energy. Ultimately, the energy that powers life on Earth comes from either the sun, heat within the Earth, or from chemical reactions. But that's not enough, because we have lots of equipment, things in our house that require and use energy. So the second part of the definition is highly ordered. Still doesn't feel like quite enough. Reproduces. Living organisms can reproduce. And so this is where you can see that if you have any one of these things, it's probably not enough. But when you start to stack them up, life has all of these characteristics together. Let's see what's next. Change through time. So life can basically respond to and adapt to its environment. So when we see something that meets all these characteristics, typically we would say that we do think that it is some form of life. An interesting side note here, since we're all stuck at home dealing with or trying to not deal with the virus, is viruses are very interesting because they don't meet the first bullet of this. They are highly ordered. A virus can't reproduce on its own. So there are a lot of questions about viruses, whether or not they actually constitute something that's actually alive, because they're basically a ball of DNA. They cannot reproduce without a living cell. They cannot use energy on their own. They can change through time. We do see viruses evolving and subject to natural selection. But viruses are kind of an interesting example of something that is sort of alive, but not quite. So, how does life work? Well, if we come back to this idea of energy, the kind of the basic unit of life is a cell. That's where the action is. And cells capture and use energy. Now, they may do this from sunlight or chemical reactions, photo or chemosynthesis. We would call those types of cells producers, because they can basically capture and store energy that other organisms can then use. And we would fall in that third bullet, where we need, or our cells need, food as a source of energy. And that food then comes from one of the first two items on the list. So let's talk about this in a little bit more detail. These are the two general processes that allow the capture and storage of energy. So photosynthesis is what people generally are a little more familiar with. A cell that photosynthesizes can take carbon dioxide and water, and using light energy can then store it as a carbohydrate. A very common carbohydrate you would be familiar with would be sugar, which is chemical formula C6H12O6, and oxygen. And plants store the carbohydrates and put the oxygen into the environment. You can see chemosynthesis is a little bit different. They still store things as carbohydrates, but they take in hydrogen sulfide and give off the sulfate ion as a byproduct. In this system where energy is captured and kind of moved around, we have two general categories of organisms. The primary producers, which are converting energy to food through these reactions, are called autotrophs because they can basically feed themselves. And then the heterotrophs are the consumers and the decomposers. The consumers and decomposers rely on the autotrophs to capture and store energy. So that's how we consume our food. It has to be produced by other organisms. And so this is kind of the flow of energy through the system. Energy from the sun, light energy, is then used by the photosynthesizers, which include plants, but also algae and some specialized bacteria, which are very often referred to as blue-green algae. They store the food, which the rest of us can then consume, and then we release that energy back into the environment when we are done with it. So we can trace this, and I'm not going to show you a whole bunch of diagrams, but there are different levels in this system. The very simplest way to look at it is a food chain. So at the start of the food chain, you would have an autotroph, a photosynthesizer usually, for example, a plant. Then something would eat that photosynthesizer, might be a little bug, and then something would eat that, might be a bird, and then something else even bigger might eat that, and then that gives you a chain of things eating things. It's not really that simple, and so a food web shows or tries to represent the more complicated web of relationships. So, for example, you personally may consume lettuce, but you might also consume some fish or a cow or something else. So you consume more than one thing. And if you look out in the environment, most organisms will consume multiple other organisms and occupy different levels in a web of life or a web of connections with these trophic relationships. When you depict a food web or even a food chain, but a food web is more representative, you can then take a measure of what is present at each level and develop a trophic pyramid. So let's take a look at the trophic pyramid. So at the bottom of the pyramid are the photosynthesizers, that's represented in green. The things that eat the photosynthesizers are level 2, and in this diagram they call them zooplankton. These are simply very small organisms in the ocean that eat the photosynthesizers. Then there are some small fish and other things that eat the zooplankton. We would call those secondary consumers, so the zooplankton would be primary consumers. And then on up the line, we have tertiary and so on consumers until you get to the very top. And the tuna is an example of a top consumer. And so the trophic pyramid shows us that at the base, we have lots and lots of photosynthesis. And as we move up through the system, each level gets smaller because as you go from one level to the next, some energy is lost. The zooplankton, for example, uses some energy to swim around. Some of the zooplankton are never consumed. And so every time you go up a level, you lose a significant amount of energy. And the pyramid depicts generally how much biomass it takes to support whatever is up at the very top level. So it just gives you an idea of what's going on in the ocean. And you can see that this tells us that most of the life in the ocean is going to be at this primary producer level. It will be the photosynthesizers. And then the second largest group will be just the next level up. You're not going to have very many tuna. You're going to have a lot of zooplankton and phytoplankton. So what we want to do now is we want to move into environmental factors that influence life, and this PowerPoint presentation will be in two parts. So we'll kind of go through these environmental factors fairly quickly, but it'll still take us a while because there are so many of them. So the factors are divided into two broad groups. There are the physical factors and the biological factors. The abiotic or physical factors are things like the temperature of the water, and biological factors are generally factors that affect life, specifically itself, like the size of an organism. Any factor that limits the normal action of the organisms is called a limiting factor. So as an example of a limiting factor, light is a limiting factor for photosynthetic organisms. If they don't have enough light, they can't photosynthesize. And so as we go through these factors, different factors, it turns out, are limiting factors for different organisms. So let's take a look at a few. The transparency of the water, that's obviously going to affect the amount of light that can get to organisms, and it also affects how well organisms can see around them. The amount of dissolved nutrients in the water, this is extremely important to photosynthetic organisms. If you think about what it takes to grow a plant, you need water, which in the ocean there's going to be plenty of. You need carbon dioxide and oxygen, so you need those dissolved gases in the water, but you really need some nutrients as well. And so dissolved nutrients turn out to be a very important limiting factor for photosynthetic organisms. The temperature of the water is very important. The temperature of the water affects different organisms in different ways. Organisms that we refer to as cold-blooded or exothermic take on the temperature of their surrounding environment. And the way that this affects them is that the lower the temperature, the lower their rate of metabolism. So their cells just work more slowly when it's cold. On the other hand, an endothermic organism can maintain their own internal body temperature. And so the way that the temperature of the surrounding water affects them is that they have to expend more energy if they are in colder water. They expend less energy if they're in warmer water. So just like you, your body would expend more energy to keep you warm if the air is cold, the same thing happens to an organism in the water. The salinity of the water is an important factor. And it actually relates to the dissolved nutrients, but it also relates to something that we're going to take a look at on the next set of slides, which will be osmosis, which turns out to be a really important factor for life in the ocean. And generally speaking, the salinity of the ocean is about 35 parts per thousand, but it actually ranges anywhere from 6 to 40. And it turns out this is going to affect what can live where. And so we'll leave this show at that, and then we'll pick it up where we left off on the next set.